So hi again, my name is Anna Ramskog-Lavit and I'm the director of the Human Rights Film Festival Berlin. Next to me, and I'm really happy that I have these both amazing experts, is Petra Laiti. She's a Sámi activist and she's going to help us to contextualize the film a bit. And next to her you find Joseph Finnerty from the Hertie School Center for Fundamental Rights, and he's going to support us in contextualizing in a broader sense as he's working on indigenous rights. So thank you both for being here. It's my pleasure. I will start with a question for Petra. If you look at the film and what it expresses, and I know it has been not that much shown in the northern countries because of COVID, but what was the reaction of the people seeing it in the context of the northern countries?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invite. Lovely to be here. I think the overwhelming response I've seen from Finnish people who've seen it is why have we not been told about this before? How do I not know about this? Why can I live in this country and not know about the struggles that these people face? And then on the other hand, you also have the people who are saying this is propaganda and this is twisting the truth, or this is misuse of the facts, which completely falls in line with the rhetoric that you all just saw being used against the Sámi people. So for me as a Sámi watching Finnish people see the movie, neither of those reactions really surprised me. And then again, with the Sámi community, I think even though I think most of the response from the Sámi community as well has been, it's been positive, of course, but I think all of us already knew what the film was going to be like, and its main audience obviously is people who have no idea about the Sámi struggles. So for me as a Sámi, it's not necessarily new to see it on screen, but what is new to me is seeing everyone else react to it and to see it being shown on such large screens to such large and wide audiences. So it's a mixed bag for sure.
And the second half of the question was what was striking to me was that when I was in the programming process of the festival and I came across this film, and I had the incredible luck that I have a fantastic Finnish student who was working with us the whole year, and she was explaining and contextualizing me the Sámi and indigenous issues. And then I started talking to people around me, and I thought there was very little awareness that there are indigenous people in Europe, and that they face so much troubles. Where do you think, as a European community, where comes it that we are not aware of this issue? Or even in Finland, as you mentioned, that many people say like, oh, we don't know that you're struggling that much.
Well, I think for Europe as a continent, it's probably, well, I think it would be uncomfortable for Europe as a continent to deal with that issue, because we have different kinds of groups in Europe who might be able to attain that status of indigenous people, and we have sort of various ethnic groups in Europe who might be able to sort of find their footing in the world through indigenous rights. And I think that's a very uncomfortable truth for many European countries to face. And I think probably European countries, at least here in Central Europe, are probably used to dealing with the legacy of colonialism in a way that colonialism is over there. It's on another continent. It's not here where we currently live. And I think part of the Finnish mentality is that for sure. But it's also in the Finnish context, and this is something you won't know if you are not accustomed to like the Finnish discussion climate, but one of the major like national identity questions for Finnish people is the fact that Finland was first a part of Sweden, and then it was conquered by Russia and then became independent. So it's very much a part of Finnish identity to think that we are a small Finnish people between two large forces who are sort of tugging at our strings. And so the Finnish identity, in some ways, I think, is an act of rebellion against both the Scandinavian identity and the Russian identity. So Finnish people already have this sense of identity where they are the minority amongst bigger people. And this is also, Cold War has a big role in this, the legacy left in Finland. But this is also one of the at least I think so, is one of the major things why Finnish people are so hesitant to confront the fact that all the while Finnish people were pressed down by Swedish rule or by Russian rule, Finnish people have all this time been doing the same thing to Sámi people. And I think that's a really difficult thing for Finnish people to confront.
Thank you so much. I would, as we just started talking about Europe, and John, I always talk with my guests during the film, as I've already seen the film, and they also, and I enjoy this. I have to say that at that point, so forgive me these references in between. As we talked before outside, you mentioned that Germany this summer actually just signed a really important UN convention, that Finland, for example, has not signed it. Could you tell us a bit more about that and how this UN convention supports indigenous rights, but also what it means that Germany has signed it?
Okay, so there are two, first of all, thank you very much for hosting us. There are two very, very important international documents, both legal documents. One of which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was pronounced in 2007, and 4 states voted against it, those being Canada, the US, Australia and New Zealand, although they have warmed to that declaration. The second very important international document is the ILO Convention on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, that is arguably more valuable to the indigenous movement. The reason being is that is legally binding on states once they choose to ratify it, in contrast to the declaration. Now, unfortunately, only 24 states have ratified that latter convention. It's very important because it provides indigenous peoples with a right to consult with their state governments when states are contemplating policy which can affect them. So it gives them a legal right to be at the table and to take part in these discussions. Now, Germany has very, very recently, this year, ratified that convention. Now, they are not a country that has indigenous peoples. However, they have they've taken this step in an act of solidarity with indigenous peoples in other jurisdictions. And that sort of level of international advocacy can help, illuminate the issue, as this film has done, and B, try and apply international political pressure on other states, such as Finland and Sweden, who are yet to ratify that convention, to consider doing so.
You just mentioned that only 24 states had ratified the convention, so my question would be, how many of those states actually have indigenous people living within their territory?
So my understanding is Luxembourg and Germany have ratified it, those being states that do not have indigenous peoples. And as far as my understanding goes, 22 states do have indigenous peoples. And I should say on that note, Norway has ratified the convention. But I should also emphasize that although it gives them a right to sit at the table and discuss matters and puts a burden on the state to seek their consent, it doesn't always fix the land use issues, the hunting and fishing issues. It just really places them at the table so that it doesn't get them all the way over the line, it just gets them to the starting point in some cases.
As you just mentioned the fishing rights in the film, we also get a bit of insights on a lawsuit filed regarding fishing rights. Petra, could you give us a bit of an update on the contextualization of this lawsuit in particular and how it supports or empowers the Sámi community?
Sure. So the fishing rights issue that you see being dealt with, at least somewhat in this movie, is what we're calling the Eatnameamet conflict. Eatnameamet is a river that runs along the Finnish and Norwegian border. So whenever decisions are made about fishing rights in that river, it's always both Finland and Norway who negotiate about these rights. And when this film was made, I was actually involved in one of the fishing rights protests in 2017, and so was Asa Kolmberg, who also talks in this film. And basically that year, the fishing rights in Eatnameamet were cut down by 80% by Norway and Finland. And by that I mean it was Sámi fishing rights that were restricted by 80% at the same time that tourists were given new kinds of rights to the river. And so when this film was made, that was a huge shock, and that was a very relevant discussion that needed to be in this film. Unfortunately, I have no good news on that front because for this summer, there was a complete ban on fishing in Eatnameamet River. So things have actually gotten worse since this film was made. And the fishing rights are being renegotiated, I think, in the coming spring. So the treaty between Norway and Finland is to be renewed anyway. But at the same time, there are 4 Sámi who, due to these fishing restrictions, they basically knowingly broke the law and turned themselves into to the authorities and went to court for the fishing rights. In order to prove on a legal level that they, as indigenous people, have a right to fish in their home river. And they've won at the level of the local courts, and then they made an arrangement where they went straight to the highest court in Finland. And to my knowledge, the decision is still being waited upon, and it's actually, I think it's late. The highest court should have made a decision on that already. But if they end up winning that court case, it should have major implications on Finnish legislation and how Sámi rights are implemented. And we have examples on Nordic level where this has succeeded. For instance, we talked about earlier outside, we talked about the Kirjas court case, which happened in Sweden, where the courts sided with the Sámi community, saying the Sámi community does have the right to steer land use and hunting and fishing rights in their area. So it's exciting times we're living in, but yeah, we'll see.
John, if you compare the situation of the Sámi people as we have seen it in the film and also to your knowledge, to other indigenous groups worldwide, where would you say there are similarities, and where would you say we as a world community would need to rapidly change things to support them?
Indeed. So I think it's also important that on the Girias case, that was 10 years of protracted litigation. So it's not often you hear a lawyer saying law isn't always the best means. But it can be a very slow, arduous process, and there can also be limitations when it comes to the costs of funding such litigation. So political and social vehicles should also always be considered as well. On the question in terms of commonalities or common themes, I would say from my perspective, there are two prevalent common issues. The first is mistrust between indigenous peoples and respective state governments. And the second is equality of arms or inequality. We've seen from the film that the mistrust or the level of mistrust from the Finnish case study is really justified. The states continue to move the markers and the goalposts, and indigenous peoples continue to have to play by the state's rules and jump through sometimes unreasonable hoops. On the issue of equality, we're seeing these commissions, the Truth Commission in this instance, sometimes tribunals in other states, that are trying to mediate disputes and pursue reconciliation or reparation. But when it comes to indigenous peoples finally getting to engage in these processes, there's very serious questions on the part of the states, sort of whether they are really acting in good faith. And again, this plays in with the mistrust issue. And sometimes indigenous peoples are going through these processes and coming out with awards of compensation, but really their true motivating factor which they're looking for is the preservation of an indigenous lifestyle for subsequent generations, as we've seen from this film. And these mechanisms aren't always enabling that for indigenous peoples. So in terms of what needs to be corrected both at the Finnish level and also in other jurisdictions is definitely this level of mistrust and inequality, and they are very, very interlinked.
I just got this sign that our time is nearly up, so I wanted to give you the possibility to ask questions. If you have, we have a lovely microphone there. It doesn't bite you. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have. It's a unique opportunity. Anyone? Yeah, please.
Do I go there?
Yeah, please. So we also have you in the stream. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love this film a lot, so that you chose it. I saw Sámi this year the first time and was really very, very impressed by it. And I thought in this film, it spoke very much to me that you can see this transgenerational trauma of these young people. They carry this burden of what has happened to their ancestors, and that impressed me because it doesn't just speak for the Sámi, it speaks, I guess, for other people too. And of course, the topic of the Anthropocene and what humans are doing to this planet. So these things said, I have a question that maybe Petra can answer best. What really fascinated me is that these young activists, like you are, so educated and informed, were in their movement, fight, uttering things that resonate very strange. For instance, here, things like language, culture, and soil are connected. And I was wondering, do you discuss that ever, that there's this kind of anachronistic movement, or that some of these sentences go against, let's say, other common, I think, ideas that we have? Just, for instance, that you would say in Germany, for instance, I want to be recognized as German, even though my parents and my ancestors haven't been born here, not walked this land. So these sentences and these discussions, these are something that interests me. Is that something that you discuss critically, or is it two different worlds for you?
Let me see if I understood the question. Do you mean in the sense that, I guess, could you clarify that a little bit?
I found it kind of interesting to hear that these very young and informed people were saying things that in another context would sound quite strange. And that is connecting language, culture, and soil, which is kind of the basis of the nationalistic, if you want, discourse that has caused all these problems. For instance, that there is kind of different national borders going through the Sámi peoples and dividing them. And that you, of course, have now a world in which the discourse often goes in the direction that you can be and want to be and identify as part of a culture whose soil and language haven't been kind of part of your legacy. So do you know what I mean? It's kind of going against the tides of the time. Does that produce problems, or don't you see it like that?
I don't see it like that. And that's because I think indigenous people all over the world, in many ways, face accusations of nationalism, when in fact what we are seeing is just people being proud of the fact that they still have a language and a culture and the soil that they inhabit, despite nationalistic forces trying to remove those things from indigenous people. And so, like for instance, I wrote a blog post where I was trying to explain this duality that indigenous people face and what Sámi face in the Nordics, where I titled the blog post, "I am not Finnish." And what I was saying that in reference to is that I identify as a Sámi. I may speak Finnish, I have a Finnish passport, but Sámi is my first language, Sámi is my first culture. And that pride in my culture is based on the fact that Finland and the other Nordic countries have for decades tried to eradicate that culture, and they have not succeeded. And this was a discussion that I also faced with some of my less educated Finnish followers and readers, where Finnish people mistake Sámi pride in their culture as nationalism, when in fact it's a matter of recognizing that this is a culture that exists and it's allowed to exist, and in its current state it is in fact the Finnish culture that is trying to marginalize the Sámi culture and Sámi languages, and it's in no way is it the Sámi's fault that this has happened to them. And rather, we should be happy for every indigenous person who feels pride in their culture, because that it's not a given. Because indigenous people all over the world have always been taught to be ashamed of who they are, and we are not that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think this was a very strong last statement. That I would just leave it like that. Thank you so much both for participating. Petra, for giving us this context and helping us to further understand the issue, and John for giving us the broader context and the legal background of everything. It was my pleasure having you. Thank you so much. For our audience, we are going to show, if you want to recommend the film, it can be found online on our streaming partner Sooner, and we are also going to show it again in the next days in one of our partner cinemas. So please go out there and tell the world about this wonderful film. Thank you so much, and have a lovely Sunday evening.